Today's topic comes from our sermon link category, and we're talking about how to meet a need that breaks God's heart. We're going to look at the book of Nehemiah, the story of Nehemiah, and what God did through this man in ancient Israel. And the question for you is, are you ready to step it up and do it in your world? Maybe there's a need in your church. Maybe there's a need in your community. Maybe there's something that has just been breaking your heart, and you know that someone has to do something about it. Are you willing to step up just like Nehemiah did and be that person? As we unpack the story of Nehemiah, we're going to look at these 4 Ds, and I hope that you'll apply them to your situation today. Here's the first thing. Desire that God would break your heart for what breaks his. Let's get a little context in Nehemiah chapter 1. It says, in late autumn, I was at the fortress of Susa. One of my brothers came to visit me with some other men who had just arrived from Judah, and I asked them about the Jews who had returned there from captivity and about how things were going in Jerusalem. So, quick backstory. God's people in the Old Testament had been taken captive. The great glory of Israel was no more, the days of David and Solomon. But by God's gracious hand, some of the Jews had been allowed to go back to Jerusalem, their hometown. And this is what Nehemiah is asking Hanani about. And so in verse 3, Hanani says, they said to me, things aren't going well for those returning to the province of Judah. They're in great trouble and disgrace. The wall of Jerusalem has been torn down and the gates have been destroyed by fire. Now, the gates of an ancient city were really important to the people in the city. It offered security and comfort. And of course, in this case, it's more than just the gates of the city. The people themselves had been torn down. And this is where we see Nehemiah's heart get broken. He responds in verse 4 like this. When I heard this report, I sat down and wept. In fact, for days I mourned, fasted, and prayed to the God of heaven. So here's my question for you and your mentor and your small group. What is it that is breaking your heart today? Maybe it's in your community, maybe it's in your workplace, maybe it's in your church. What need is present there for you that maybe God is calling you today to step up and address? Desire that God would break your heart for that situation. And then do the second thing. Determine to make prayer a priority in your life. This is what Nehemiah did in verses 5 and 6. It says, then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of unfailing love with those who love him and obey his commands, listen to my prayer. And if you go back to the text in verse 6, you'll see that he confesses the sin of his people, the sin of his family, his own personal sin. And then he calls on God in verse 8 to remember the promise that he had given to Moses. In fact, I encourage you to take some time to read this full prayer in the rest of Nehemiah chapter 1. And then in your own life, make a determination to make prayer a priority for that thing that is breaking your heart in the name of God. And then move on to this third thing, and that's to develop a spirit of determination to do whatever it takes. Now, at this point, I encourage you to take some time and read Nehemiah chapter 2 to get a little bit more of the context. But let me give a quick summary. Nehemiah was actually a wine taster for the king, which was a really important job. It means that the king trusted him enough to sort of be his first line of defense against an attack. And as you read the story, Nehemiah shares with his boss, the king, why his heart is so broken. He's willing to step out and act. So the king lets Nehemiah go to Jerusalem to inspect the wall, and it's there that Nehemiah starts to take more action. Thanks to Nehemiah's influence to begin to rebuild the wall of Jerusalem. But by the time we get to Nehemiah chapter 4, we realize that some enemies rise up and they start to oppose the rebuilding of the walls of Jerusalem. And this is where we see Nehemiah's spirit of determination kick in. In chapter 4, verses 22 and 23, it says this, at that time, I also said to the people, have every man and his helper stay inside Jerusalem at night so they can serve us as guards by night and as workers by day. And then it says, neither I nor my brothers, nor my men, nor the guards with me took off our clothes. Each had his weapon, even when he went for water. Verse 17 in the text gives us this cool image. It says that the laborers carried on their work with one hand supporting their load and one hand holding a weapon. So the vision you get is a guy with a trowel in his left hand and a sword in his right hand. What a cool picture of the determination it took to build this wall. And the reality is the enemy is going to come up against you when you try to do something great in the name of God. And so you have to have the determination of Nehemiah. And then the final thing is this: you need to demonstrate a commitment to sacrifice greatly. We see what that meant for Nehemiah in chapter 5. It says that I also devoted myself to working on the wall and refused to acquire any land, and I required all my servants to spend time working on the wall. And then in verse 17, he says, I asked for nothing, even though I regularly fed 150 Jewish officials at my table, besides all the visitors from other lands. Now that's how Nehemiah demonstrated his commitment to sacrifice. But I love what it says in 2 Corinthians 8, because we get a New Testament example of this here. Paul says this: I want you to know, dear brothers and sisters, what God in his kindness has done through the churches in Macedonia. They're being tested by many troubles, and they are very poor, but they are also filled with abundant joy, which has overflowed in rich generosity. Notice it says that they were poor, and yet they were very generous. So for you today, as you consider how to meet a need that breaks God's heart, don't look at it from the perspective of what you don't have or of what you lack, but think of it like Nehemiah and step up in your world to do something great for God's kingdom.